On November 13, 2022, 4 University of Idaho students were killed inside an off-campus house at 1122 King Road in Moscow, Idaho. A crime that ended with Bryan Kohberger's guilty plea, but began in hours no one in that neighborhood could explain. Hours earlier, the night had looked ordinary. Moscow police said Kaylee Gonkovs and Madison Mogan were at the corner club until about 1:30 a.m., then seen at the grub truck around 1:40, before arriving back at the house at about 1:45. Investigators also said Xana Kernadel and Ethan Chapin were seen at the Sigma Chai House and were believed to have returned to King Road at about 1:45 a.m. 2 surviving roommates were home by 1 a.m. Then came the gap that still defines this case. The space between those last confirmed movements in late morning, when surviving roommates summoned friends because they believed one of the second-floor victims had passed out and was not waking up. At 11:58 a.m., a 911 call went out for an unconscious person. Responding officers found 4 victims dead on the second and third floors. In those first public updates, the story was brutally spare. 4 students, 1 rental house, and nearly 10 missing hours between the last ordinary sightings and the first emergency call. That empty stretch of time became the center of everything. Before the suspect, before the courtroom, before the plea, there was only a silent house and a question that Moscow could not escape. What happened inside 1122 King Road before anyone realized a crime had begun? In the first days after the killings, investigators tried to calm a city that was already slipping into fear. On November 15th, Moscow police said the deaths were homicides, that no weapon had been found, and that investigators believed an edged weapon such as a knife had been used. In the same update, they said evidence indicated a targeted attack and that they did not believe there was an ongoing threat to the community. That was the first official theory, and it landed with almost as much weight as the crime itself, because it answered one question while opening another. If this was targeted at whom? By the next day, the certainty had already started to fray. At the November 16th press conference, Chief James Fry said police had no suspect and no murder weapon. He also walked back the earlier reassurance, saying investigators could not say there was no threat to the community because the person responsible had not been identified. That reversal changed the emotional temperature of the case. The town was no longer staring at a sealed-off tragedy. It was staring at an unknown offender who, at least officially, could still be out there. Then came the autopsy findings. Police released that the 4 victims died by homicide from stabbing. The coroner said they were likely asleep. Some had defensive wounds. Each had been stabbed multiple times, and there was no sign of sexual assault. Detectives began asking for surveillance footage from a crucial window, 3 a.m. to 6 a.m., suggesting that somewhere inside those 3 hours was the movement that could break the case open. And once investigators fixed their eyes on that narrow slice of time, the entire mystery started closing in on a single unseen path through Moscow. By early December, the investigation had become a race between volume and precision. Moscow police said detectives had already received more than 2,770 calls, over 2,645 emails, and more than 1,084 digital media submissions, while collecting 113 pieces of physical evidence, taking about 4,000 crime scene photographs, and building multiple 3-dimensional scans of the King Road house. The case looked enormous from the outside, but investigators were still searching for one concrete thread that could hold. That thread surfaced in the form of a vehicle. On December 7th, police publicly asked for help identifying the occupant or occupants of a white 2011 to 2013 Hyundai Elantra seen in the immediate area of the King Road residence during the early morning hours of November 13th. Investigators said they believed the person inside might have critical information. It was a striking moment because after weeks of public fear, the first truly specific lead was not a person, a weapon, or a confession. It was a car, and the more the public focused on that white Elantra, the more the pressure shifted. Police repeated the appeal on December 8th and again on December 12th, making clear they were still hunting that same vehicle and still believed it mattered. By December 19th, the investigation had passed 10,000 tips and leads. To the public, that suggested a case sprawling in every direction. But according to the affidavit unsealed later, investigators had already learned that a white sedan had moved through the neighborhood multiple times before dawn and then sped away. The public saw a car description, but detectives were already closing in on where that car had gone next. The white Elantra was no longer just a public tip. Behind the scenes, it was turning into a map. According to the probable cause affidavit, after Moscow police asked area agencies to watch for white Hyundai Elantras, Washington State University officer Daniel Tengo searched vehicles registered at WSU on November 29th and found a 2015 white Hyundai Elantra registered to Bryan Kohberger, then a doctoral student in Pullman. Another WSU officer, Curtis Whitman, also located a white 2015 Elantra at Kohberger's apartment complex that same day. That mattered immediately, because Pullman sat just across the state line from Moscow, and investigators already believed the suspect vehicle had returned there before dawn. Then, the affidavit added something even more unsettling. One of the surviving roommates had described seeing a masked man with bushy eyebrows walking past her in the house during the critical window. Investigators later noted that Kohberger's driver's license photo was consistent with that description. It was not proof by itself, but it tightened the circle. A car in Pullman, a man in the house, a physical feature that investigators believed overlapped. The case was no longer floating through rumor. It was beginning to point in one direction. Phone data deepened that direction. Investigators said Kohberger's phone appeared near his Pullman apartment until about 2:42 a.m., then went dark during the period of the killings before reconnecting south of Moscow at 4:48 a.m. The silence in between was one of the most chilling parts of the affidavit, because detectives now had a car, a name, and a gap they believed might not be accidental. And the next break would come from something left behind inside the house. What investigators found inside the house now became the hinge of the entire case. In the probable cause affidavit, police said a tan leather knife sheath was recovered on the bed next to Madison Mogan's body, and that a single source of male DNA was later identified on the button snap. It was a small object in a room filled with devastation, but it carried something the case had lacked for weeks: a biological trail that could be tested, compared, and followed. At the same time, investigators were still building the movement around the white Elantra and the phone they believed traveled with it, turning separate clues into one tightening line. That line stretched all the way to Pennsylvania. According to the affidavit, on December 27th, investigators recovered trash from the Kohberger family residence in Albrightsville and sent it to the Idaho State Lab. The next day, the lab reported that the DNA profile from that trash indicated a paternal match to the male DNA from the Sheath, with the affidavit stating that at least 99.9998% of the male population would be expected to be excluded from being the suspect's biological father. It did not end the case in a courtroom, but it changed everything for investigators in real time. The mystery was no longer only who might fit the evidence. It was whether authorities now had enough to move. They did. On December 30th, 2022, Moscow police announced that Bryan Christopher Kohberger had been arrested in Pennsylvania on a fugitive warrant and was wanted on 4 counts of first-degree murder and 1 count of felony burglary. But the arrest raised a new question, just as chilling as the old one. Once he was brought back to Idaho, what exactly would the affidavit say police believed happened inside 1122 King Road? By January 5, 2023, the case changed from a manhunt into a public legal record. 2 days earlier, Bryan Kohberger had waived extradition in Pennsylvania. On January 4th, he was transported back to Idaho. Then, after his first court appearance in Latah County on January 5th, the sealed probable cause affidavit was unsealed, and for the first time the public could see, line by line, what investigators said had led them to the accused. He was ordered held without bond. A preliminary hearing was initially set for later that month. What the affidavit revealed was more disturbing than rumor, and more disciplined than speculation. Investigators said the white Hyundai Elantra had been captured on surveillance making repeated passes by the King Road home before 4 a.m. They said cell phone records placed Kohberger's phone using cellular resources consistent with the area near the residence on at least 12 occasions before the killings, mostly at night or in the early morning hours. And they said a surviving roommate reported hearing sounds she did not understand, opening her door more than once, and eventually seeing a masked man with bushy eyebrows walk past her toward the sliding glass door. Comment: truth matters if you believe in justice and awareness. For the public, this was the first moment the case seemed to have shape. But even then, the affidavit answered only how investigators reached an arrest. It did not answer the question hanging over everything: why prosecutors believed Bryan Kohberger chose that house, that night, and those 4 victims. The next shock did not come from a new crime scene detail. It came from the courtroom. On May 16, 2023, a Latah County grand jury indicted Bryan Kohberger on 1 count of burglary and 4 counts of first-degree murder. 6 days later, at his arraignment, the court noted the indictment, confirmed that he understood the charges and potential penalties, and after he stood silent, entered not guilty pleas on his behalf. In a case that had already consumed months of public attention, the legal fight suddenly accelerated. The question was no longer only what investigators believed happened inside 1122 King Road. It was how aggressively prosecutors intended to pursue the accused. At that same arraignment, the court made clear the next turning point was coming fast. The state had 60 days to say whether it would seek the death penalty. On June 26th, prosecutors filed that notice. With 1 document, the case became a capital prosecution. That changed the weight of every future hearing, every motion, every delay. The stakes were no longer measured only in guilt or innocence, but in whether the state would try to put the accused to death if convicted. It was a legal escalation as stark as anything that had happened since the arrest. Then, in August 2023, another shift. Kohberger signed a formal waiver of his right to a speedy trial, acknowledging the case could now be tried more than 6 months after arraignment. The October trial date disappeared, and the prosecution entered a longer, more punishing phase built around motions, evidence battles, and time. The mystery had become a legal siege, and the next question was whether this case could ever reach a jury without being transformed again. By the fall of 2024, the case itself had not changed, but the battlefield had. On September 6th, Latah County Judge John Judge granted Bryan Kohberger's motion to change venue, and on September 12th, the Idaho Supreme Court ordered the trial transferred to Ada County, sending the prosecution nearly 300 miles south to Boise. The reasoning was stark. The court pointed to intense pretrial publicity, courthouse limitations, and security concerns that threatened the ability to seat a fair jury in Latah County. What began in a college town would now be decided in the state capital, under a new judge, in a new courtroom, with the same accusations carrying even heavier national attention. Judge Stephen Hippler then reset the clock. In an October 2024 scheduling order, he set voir dire to begin July 30th, 2025, with trial starting August 11th and running through November 7th if a penalty phase became necessary. That schedule made one thing unmistakable. Idaho was still preparing to try the case as a capital prosecution. The legal pressure only deepened in early 2025, when Hippler denied sweeping defense efforts to suppress key evidence, including challenges aimed at DNA evidence, digital records, and multiple warrants. For prosecutors, it was a major win. For the defense, it meant the evidence they most wanted kept from jurors was still alive. Then, in June 2025, the defense asked again for more time. Hippler said he would rule in writing but told both sides to be ready anyway, a warning that the case was moving toward its biggest collision yet. And just as that collision seemed unavoidable, something happened behind closed doors that changed the ending of this case forever. Then, less than 6 weeks before jurors were supposed to be brought in, the case turned again. On July 2nd, 2025, Bryan Kohberger stood in an Ada County courtroom and pleaded guilty to 4 counts of first-degree murder and 1 count of burglary. The plea agreement ended the death penalty phase of the case and locked in the punishment prosecutors said they would seek instead: 4 consecutive life sentences for the murders, plus up to 10 years on the burglary count, with no possibility of parole and a waiver of appeal rights. After years of motions, sealed filings, and anticipation of a capital trial, the legal ending arrived in a matter of minutes. What made the hearing so stark was how little was left unresolved in that room. Judge Stephen Hippler asked Kohberger if he was pleading guilty because he was guilty, and Kohberger answered yes. According to reporting from the hearing, Hippler also asked whether he killed each of the 4 students, and Kohberger answered yes each time. The whole trial that had been expected to run through the fall was over before it began. There would be no jury verdict, no death penalty hearing, and no public testing of the evidence in the way many had expected since the arrest. But the plea did not bring a single shared sense of closure. Public reporting and statements around the hearing showed the victims' families were divided, with some supporting the agreement as a path to certainty, and others condemning the loss of a full trial and a possible death sentence. Even after the guilty plea, the case still had one final reckoning left. The court set sentencing for July 23rd, and that meant the next chapter would not be about whether Kohberger admitted the murders. It would be about what the families chose to say when he could no longer deny them. On July 23, 2025, the case reached its final legal destination. In Boise, Judge Stephen Hippler sentenced Bryan Kohberger to 4 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole for the murders of Madison Mogan, Kaylee Gonkovs, Xana Kernadel, and Ethan Chapin, plus a separate 10-year sentence for burglary. The official judgment also imposed fines and civil penalties. There would be no trial, no appeal, and no future hearing where the basic question of guilt would be argued again. The legal system had reached its answer. But sentencing did not bring the thing many people had spent nearly 3 years hoping for: an explanation. During the hearing, friends, relatives, and surviving roommate Dylan Mortensen addressed Kohberger directly, describing the lives that were shattered and the emptiness left behind. When given the chance to speak, Kohberger answered only, "I respectfully decline." Judge Hippler acknowledged that the motive may never be known, a reality that left the courtroom with punishment but not closure in the purest sense. That is the haunting truth at the end of this story. The record is now clear about who admitted these murders and how the court punished him. What remains unclear is why 4 young lives were taken inside that house on King Road. And maybe that is the hardest lesson in the case. Justice can name the offender, sentence the offender, and lock the door behind him forever. But it cannot always return the answer the families wanted most.